War is, endemic in human history. The human beings have engaged in forms of warfare for a very, very long period of time, and we are still doing so in a world which regrets it. Of course, world opinion in inverted commas thinks how bad these things are. Please don't do them, but they still go on. Countries are now busy rearming because they think they might face threats in the future. You know, what obviously we would like is for people to look at the history of war, my presentation of the history of war, and say to themselves, this is madness. Human beings have got to sit down in the 21st century, and we've got to be able to ensure that we don't do this anymore. Uh, a starting point might be, let's get rid of nuclear weapons, but we know that's not going to happen either. There's a horrible sense, I think, in which human beings, are their own worst enemy. We know how we ought to behave, and we know the kind of risks that we run. But here we still are in 2025 with people making rhetorical threats of nuclear warfare.
Welcome to Upstream. I'm John Bell. We're very happy to have with us today Richard Overy. Welcome, Richard, to our
Thank you.
podcast. Richard is one of Britain's most distinguished historians. He is honorary research professor at the University of Exeter. One of his most recent books, Blood and Ruins, The Great Imperial War, 1931-45, was a New York Times bestseller. His other major works include The Dictators, winner of the 2005 Wolfson Prize, The Morbid Age, and The Bombing War, which won a Cundall Award. He's a fellow of the British Academy and a member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. Richard, most welcome and very happy to have you with us.
Thank you.
We're here to discuss this very interesting book, Why War, which upon reading I found most interesting, Richard, because you've done something which most authors, historians don't do. Most writers take a theme and weave it through a subject. You've looked at war from many, many different angles, from biology to resources as causes of war to security, many, many different ones. Before we actually get into the substance, why did you take such an interesting multi-angle, multi-perspective approach to study a subject as big as war? Why did you decide to do that?
Well, I was prompted to write the book in the first place, I suppose, by the work I'd done some time ago on the correspondence between Freud and Einstein, 1932, prompted by the League of Nations, where Einstein asked Freud the question, why war, thinking that there would be a simple answer in psychology, that would be the answer. Of course, Freud didn't have the answer, naturally enough. And this has prompted me really to think about, all the various ways in the past century that scholars and philosophers and historians have tried to explain why war. I mean, it's a major question for the human race. It's a major question even today. Why war? And of course, there isn't a simple answer. There isn't a single answer. I looked at what I regard as perhaps the most important range of answers that people have come up with, which includes biological arguments, psychological, anthropological, ecological. And then I looked at the various motives one might have: resources, belief, power, security. And I think that covered most of the main bases. I mean, the effect, of course, is to show people that explaining war is enormously complex, and can be undertaken from a wide variety of different scholarly perspectives.
Well, exactly, Richard, in the sense that before we get into some of the substance of what you found out, looking at each angle, what I find quite useful about the book, and one reason I'd recommend it directly, is that by looking at it from various angles of causation, you put all of them in perspective. And I think that's useful in itself, so that people tend to rush to simplified answers. There's always a mitigating other dimension to look at. And that's already, I think, in itself a very useful um, way to look at something as complex as war.
Yeah. I mean, what I really want people to do, of course, is to read this book and to be able to start thinking themselves, make their own mind up, perhaps, about what they regard as the most, the single most important explanation, or simply accept that that war has happened all through history. It's happened in a wide variety of different contexts, political, geographical, and so on, and that therefore there isn't a simple answer. That wars have to be explained in a number of different terms. And the problem, of course, with that is that you end up realizing that that war is not just a single thing you might be able to get rid of. Actually, war is embedded in the way in which human history has developed.
Indeed, and we'll come to that a bit later in the sense of what major conclusions to draw out of it. But what you just described happened to me on reading it, which was to test, well, what did I think, etc. So, mission achieved on that level. Um, Maybe we can dive into it a bit. Let me just say, meaning that if you could give us a kind of tour d'horizon about all the different issues that you decided to address as causes, but you did divide the book into two major sections. One, factors that in a way impel us to war, that are that pull us towards it, and others where we pull ourselves, where we're more proactive in doing so, or at least maybe more consciously so. Can you describe the structure of the book a bit, the two sections, and then the major causes, so that we have that overview?
Well, I divide it into two, partly to cope, I think, with the fact that I'm looking at the history of human violence going back perhaps 100,000 years or more. So that, for much of the period I'm writing about, of course, there is no formal history, no really very good record. But I wanted to focus on what evolutionary scientists say about war, looking at biology, looking at psychology, also anthropology as well, because quite clearly humans did resort to violence at times when necessary or in defense and so on, not just in the last 5,000 years of recorded history, but over tens of thousands of years as human beings uh, evolved, began to create larger communities, began to compete with each other, possibly for resources, for food or whatever. And we have enough evidence, I think, to suggest that violence has been around for a long time. Uh, so we need to ask ourselves why. And I think one of the things I wanted to look at was to test arguments that many people dismiss. The idea that there's a kind of evolutionary explanation for warfare is unpopular in some circles, but it seemed to me to be imperative to look at that because, quite clearly, human beings are a belligerent species, and they've obviously been a belligerent species for a long time. And the same is true of ecology, which some people might regard as a rather odd chapter. But for a lot of the time, human beings have been quite obviously prey to major shifts in the climate, major shifts in geography and topography and so on. They've been subject to, the loss of food supplies, and so quite often the evidence suggests this also impels violence. People compete for land. They compete for hunting grounds. They are pushed to migrate because of sharp changes in the climate and so on. And we have enough evidence, even from the historical period, the modern period, more modern period, to support that argument. But I also wanted really to look, because we're a conscious species, and we quite clearly engage in violence consciously, to look at the principal motives. Um, Now, of course, there are hundreds of minor motives that one might be able to pick out. But I wanted to focus particularly on four that seem to be important. One is resources, uh, which is an obvious motive, and we can see all the way through historical time too that there are people around who are greedy for other people's resources, or people fight in order to protect their resources. Belief is also very important, and it goes back a long way. And it can cover all kinds of things from a tribe's cosmology. They have to make war every year to satisfy the gods or whatever it is, to modern fascism and the wave of violence from the 20th century. Um, and then power. Well, I think many people assume, and I've been told this by other people, I assume that power is the critical factor. I don't think it is a critical factor. I think it's power for something. And so we need to know what it is people want power for. Uh, but occasionally you get a leader who does thirst for power for its own sake and makes war in order to enhance their power, like Napoleon, like Hitler. And finally, security. Well, security I regarded in some ways as the most important thing. Coming back to Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher in the 17th century, who said that, that's what we all want. We all need security. And how do you get it? Well, it's very difficult. And the only way you can get it, he says, is to protect yourselves or to fight others. Um, and I think security, protecting, whether you're protecting a hunter-gatherer tribe or whether you're protecting Ukraine today, that security is a critical factor. Uncertainty about other people, mistrust of other people, fear of other people can prompt you in the end to violence in order to establish your own security. Security is, in fact, of course, an extremely fragile concept. We think we have it, and then it disappears through our fingers again. So we're constantly searching for security. And the 21st century is a century where everybody is uncertain about the future. Everybody is thinking about their own security. They're busy rearming again. Whoever would have thought that would happen? But here we are.
Well, that's interesting because I don't know if it was the effect of your book or my own biases working in international relations, but I did walk away from reading it thinking of security as the most powerful of the motives as well.
Yeah.
Um, but I also I found what you had to say about evolutionary psychology and how we may have likely evolved psychologically in order to have more efficient bands or gangs of young men to fight. It's because it is mostly young men that fight. That psychological development um, may be built into us through evolution of hundreds of thousands of years. I also found that very interesting. Related to that, though, a question you touched on it. Why do, can you explain a bit more why today there are doubts about that kind of cause of war? What's the other side? Is it the kind of more purely cultural, and what does that mean? What's the trend these days in explaining war?
Well, I mean, there's quite a lot of hostility to the idea that somehow or other we've been biologically or psychologically programmed for war, simply because, many people think, well, that's not true. We can stop it. We can stop ourselves making war. It's not something which, is built into our evolutionary past. I think the difficulty with that is that, how do we explain the violence of the past tens of thousands of years? How do we explain that human beings all over the world, not just in some place or some other place, all over the world, have organized themselves for war and persist in doing so, even into the 21st century, where we all think that peace is perhaps the best thing? Why can't we, in fact, sit down and make peace? Now, the psychological imperative, I think, is quite interesting, and there is a strong reaction against that. That somehow or other, we think the boys are programmed for fight and girls are programmed to, look after the house. Well, you can see that in its simple form, that's, that's not likely to be a popular statement. But it's not as simple as that. I think, if we look back 100,000 years or so, we're going to find that among these bands wandering around, or indeed, settled bands as well, that the men will go out and fight and hunt. And the women will gather foodstuffs, they will look after the children, they will, in a sense, hold the community together. And that's a bifurcation that I think happened a long time ago. And, men have become programmed to think like that. It's only men really who are violent. It's only men who think it's their responsibility to protect the household, protect the community, or protect the nation. And I think, it's not that it's built into our brain, but I think what evolutionary psychologists argue is that we have various components in our brain in which, trigger particular reactions. And we have those components for violence, either in defense or in aggression, and not necessarily the same thing. But that somehow or other, you know, that's what we do and what men do principally when they're faced with threat, they're faced with ambition, fears, insecurity, whatever it is. But something triggers, and they're willing to uh, join that effort in protecting the community or violating another one.
Well, at the Conciliators Guild, which is the organization behind this podcast, we put a lot of emphasis on our psychological nature and a better understanding of that in order to get a handle on conflict resolution, actually. So, what you're saying fits with the way we look at things. And in fact, also, even myself personally, having worked on conflict across the world, I also think that the way to address conflict is to have a better understanding of exactly what you're talking about, which is, I think you even described it in your book as a universal psychological disposition, war.
Yeah,
And I don't see myself, at least, an exclusivity between doing that and also agreeing that we can be also cooperative creatures. They're both truths, and we need to navigate both.
yeah. Well, I mean, many people argue that when we look at the distant past, the evolution of human communities and so on, that these two things are not exclusive at all. They go together, in fact. And in fact, that the capacity to be able to conduct violence effectively, to protect yourself effectively, and so on, requires a high level of cooperation. Otherwise people are individuals and they look after themselves. But to engage in that kind of tribal violence, you need to collaborate. You need to understand how to collaborate and so on. Now, it would be nice if we could argue that in order to collaborate, people create a situation in which it's possible to be peaceable, to collaborate with other groups rather than to feel threatened or insecure as a result of other groups. Uh, and in a way, that ought to be the ideal, but it is extremely difficult to see under circumstances of stress, evident for the 21st century. It's very difficult to see how you can bring that about. The sensible thing for the Russians, the Ukrainians to do, for the Israelis and the Gazans to do, is to sit down and to work out how to solve the problem. But they create the problem, and they think the war is a solution.
Well, I hope to get into some practical cases with you in a bit, but I'd like to dig into one other chapter a bit more with you before doing that. One I found very interesting. I think you titled it Belief. Um, and I think it's an underrated chapter. I think you focus a lot on religious belief as a cause of war. Go back to the Crusades and demonstrate what happened then. Some of the more radical Islamic fundamentalism in our era being another example. But also, and if I'm not wrong, ideological belief if it goes too far. And I found that chapter very interesting, and I'll link it back to what you said about power. It isn't just about power, it's for power for something, something quite specific. But the belief chapter is also very important because of the dehumanizing aspect when we have very, very strong beliefs. So, can you tell us a bit more about what you had discovered by looking at belief and religious belief as a cause of war?
Yes, I mean, there's again quite a lot of hostility to the argument that belief really is, helps to cause war. I think quite a number of modern social scientists assume that belief is a cover for something else, for economic motives, for a sense of social protest and so on. But I think we have to take belief, as it is. Now, if we look at the way anthropologists study belief, looking at tribes with tribal religions and so on, in which they have to appease the god every year, perhaps by going out and taking sacrifices. They believe that the tribe next to them is engaging in black magic, and the only way they can cope with that is to eliminate the tribe. Uh, you can see all kinds of ways in which belief takes people over, and I think we can't ignore that. When it comes to modern religious conflict, for example, the development of jihad, Islamic war in the 20th century, Again, there's a temptation to say, oh, well, these are, frustrated young youths and so on, got nothing to do. But it's not true at all. You don't engage in this kind of struggle unless it's something that you really believe in. And I think that belief right the way back, and we can go all the way back to, ancient Rome if you want, or earlier, uh, having a set of beliefs based on religion, superstition, and cosmology, and so on, uh, is it very important for holding a society together, and often for justifying why it is they engage in violence. And I think we can't set it aside and say, oh well, actually, it's a cover for something else. I think it is what it is.
Well, I think that's a crucial point that we should not always reduce things to a material interest, and that the symbolic or emotional value of a belief is in itself a motive, and such a powerful motive that it could be a motive for violence and war, as you are saying. In fact, in our general approach at the Guild towards politics and conflict, we put a lot of emphasis on innate human needs, human nature in a way. We've already touched on two, security being one key one. And the one I would say that's related to belief is meaning. People absolutely need meaning in their lives. And if beliefs provides that, and that belief is threatened in any way, they will fight for it. I would think that's another way to kind of say the same thing as I think you've just said in our own version of it. So I'm glad you've emphasized that, because I think it does drive war and conflict, and is doing so in today's world much more in itself, much more than people realize. Um, can I turn to having covered this very quickly? I mean, it's a book of many, many hundreds of pages. Um, uh, can I turn to an overall conclusion that you've made from the book? And in a way, it's summed up right at the beginning of your chapter conclusion. I'll just read a quote uh, by Kenneth Waltz. And it says, theorists explain what historians know: war is normal. People may not like that a lot, as you've hinted at so far, but I do think it's valuable to dwell on that a bit. Is war normal?
Yes, I mean you're quite right. People don't like that phrase very much, uh, and I mean war is normal in the sense that it's not simply, as some people like to present it, an aberration, something that happens by accident. It'd be rather better if human history hadn't got it. And indeed, quite a number of studies of the past, of course, can actually ignore war. Altogether. I mean, I went to a museum recently, of what's it, Bronze Age relics and so on and so on, and you can actually display a whole society of that without talking about war at all, or indeed displaying a weapon. And this is extremely misleading way of looking at the problem. War is integral. We look at ancient Greece, we look at ancient Rome, we look at the Christian age, the early Christian age, when they're not supposed to make war at all. They're supposed to love peace and love thy neighbor. They don't. They make war a lot, and they justify it in various ways. So when Kenneth Waltz says war is normal, he means it's what human beings do. We don't do it all the time. We don't do it everywhere all the time, but it's happened so often and so regularly through history in such a wide variety of different contexts that we shouldn't try and put it to one side. Because if we put it to one side, we won't understand it. What we need to do is to embrace it as part of a human experience, past human experience, present human experience, and in explaining it, I mean, maybe we will draw a step nearer to understanding how we might have, eliminated.
Because I think that's very well put. And the desire to skip it in a way may be more dangerous than actually,
Yeah,
as you just
yeah,
said, embracing it and then getting to solutions. I think
yeah.
that's very well put. Um, one more question about the substance of the book, which is very rich. And before that, I should say, I think another advantage of reading it is your research really demonstrates how war is endemic historically, back in time and to today, and anthropologically, meaning across all cultures. Your examples of very brutal war between groups that we would never imagine as having had war, not in our, maybe my simple imagination, for example, the Inuit and the Eskimos, um, are very useful in showing how universal this theme is amongst all of us. So, but there's another aspect which is in the structure of your book that I just want to explore a bit before we get to today, which is also important. Um, in a way, you do explain through biology, psychology, our response to ecological threats, that we're a bit wired for war. We're also wired for cooperation. I'm just saying that so that people don't think we're only emphasizing one side. We're wired for it, and yet the latter half of the book demonstrates how we also make conscious decisions for war. And I think that's a very useful duality, that we're wired and yet we're conscious. And humans have wild imaginations, which is I think the zone where the wiredness and the consciousness meet. Um, how can you tell us a bit more about what you found about how we make conscious decisions towards war? Why do you think people choose war consciously?
No, I mean, I think many people argue that it's leaders who choose war, and therefore people on the whole would rather not have war. But there are plenty of anthropological examples of societies where everybody makes war and they make collective decisions to make war and so on. And indeed, even where there is a leader, in early medieval Europe, for example, it's what the knights wanted to do. They wanted to fight, and they're also, the leader is often driven to do something he actually doesn't particularly want to do, but he knows that that's what his army wants to do. Um, and I think that the important thing is that people identify a range uh, of possible modes of action. You can collaborate, you can trade, you can exchange, and so on. But that there will come moments where you feel that your belief system is threatened, or you feel that the ground of your economic prosperity is being undermined, and so on. Or if you're on the steppe and you get a long period of Russian steppe, you get a long period of arid summers. You've got to find somewhere else to pasture your animals. Where do you find it? You find it at somebody else's expense. So people do make conscious decisions, but they are related, as you can see from that last example. They are related, of course, to the broader issues that shape how human beings respond to their environment, or their possibilities. But they do make conscious decisions, and don't, on the whole, see it as wrong or irrational. The rational actor model ought to, of political science ought to suggest that we don't do this. That war is costly, damaging. There must be better ways of doing it, etc., etc. But over and over and over again, people think that that's not the case. That war actually is the better way of doing it, the more effective way of doing it, the justified way of doing it. And as long as we are capable of weaving a set of motives which seem rational to us. Let's look at the arguments today in Israel about why they are making war in Gaza. It's very easy to create a web of motives which seem to justify what it is you're doing.
Well, I've worked on the Middle East for most of my life, politically, diplomatically. And I can't tell you the number of times that Westerners, especially Europeans, but Westerners in general, told me how irrational the wars of the Middle East were, which they are to some degree, by the way. However, once the war in Ukraine happened, the notability of irrationality went out the window. So it's irrational until we're doing it, and then it makes perfect sense. tends to be a common approach to war. Um, Given what we're just saying, and we begun to touch on some live conflicts, I'd like to turn now to today and the meaning of your book and of a lot of what you've said now to today. I mean, we're living in a very strange era, highly interconnected, but with absolutely deadly weaponry, nuclear, hypersonic missiles, chemical, biological, cyber warfare, much of it marked by devastating power of destruction as well as speed. I mean, these hypersonic missiles leave no time for any response from either side to prevent or deter a situation. And I'll quote something from your book before diving in to that whole question of how you think your book applies today. Power exploited cynically by leaders to wage war in the name of a providential mission is the most dangerous and unpredictable cause of war from the classical world to the 21st century. So you think that that attitude is still alive today, and alive and kicking, first of all?
Well, it's difficult not to argue that in the case perhaps of Ukraine, where it is driven by a hubristic leader who really thinks that this will solve his problems, his society's problems, and indeed that he is in a sense destined to lead this campaign to secure Russia and to turn Russia once again into a major power. Uh, in the case of Israel and Gaza too, we can see very much the same kind of factors at work. But these are not, of course, the only conflicts. If we look at Myanmar, we look at Sudan, we look at the Congo now. Uh, in all these cases, we see insecurity, rivalry, ambition, politicians and military leaders who are determined to push through their program at the expense, indeed, of their own community. Uh, all of these things have a very, very long history. Nothing new about it. And I think that the worrying thing perhaps is that I suppose even 10 years ago we assumed this wasn't going to happen. It was going to it was somehow it was just going to melt away. Uh, but it hasn't. It's been an extremely violent first 25 years of this century. Whether we're looking at Syria or we're looking at Libya or looking at Africa or now Ukraine and Gaza and so on. So yes, leaders and a military elite and so on plays still a determining role in the decision for war, and don't see war as something that you shouldn't, you should reach for at the very last minute. They see war, as I said before, war as a solution, whereas you and I probably see war as the problem. And as long as there are going to be political leaders and military leaders who will go on thinking that war, under certain circumstances, will be the solution, then we face that kind of risk. We talked just now about the nature of the weaponry. What's striking, of course, is that all the way across the whole of the period I'm talking about, from flint axes to thermonuclear bombs, human beings have gone on, refining their means to destroy each other. What an irrational thing to do! But they do it. They do it because they think that somebody else might do it, and they are the one. You've got to be able to secure yourself by making sure you match the weaponry of others, and that's driven uh, the possibility of waging war right the way across the historical period. Now, people who make the weapons, don't declare war, but people who make the weapons enable war to be waged and to be waged in more and more deadly ways.
First, I'm very tragically glad in a way that you've mentioned that this century has demonstrated how warlike we still are. I agree. And there's another point, which is that it is leaders that in the end take us to war. Um, Despite the fact there are many cases where people foolishly wish to go to war as a collective. And I'm also wondering about whether anybody in a leadership position, once you're in that, rather than sitting comfortably in one's home as an average citizen, actually being a leader, whether it's one is more prone to go to war because of the sense of responsibility of protecting one's people. That could be an excuse. I'm not denying that, but I do think that two factors: rivalry between leaders, a sense of status of nations, and the second, an absolute responsibility not to look weak for your own people, make leaders prone to make decisions of war. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly the case that they can make decisions for because they have an ambition to achieve something abroad, or because they want to satisfy their population, or they think it will boost their own political power at home and so on. I think that there's another factor, though. I think that it isn't just leaders. It's not difficult to whip up nationalist enthusiasm for something. And look at the way in which the Russian people have supported Putin in a war which otherwise you think they would really not, rather not be waging. And to think of the classic example, of course, the First World War. How when the First World War broke out, there were crowds rejoicing in all the squares. Young men were rushing to volunteer, and so on and so on. They wanted, that our nation at risk, our nation under threat, and off they went, and they went again 20 years later for an even more deadly war. So I think that leaders can, some leaders, not all leaders, of course, but some leaders can be prone to see war as something. It's in their toolbox. It's something they will take out if they think they will need it. However pacific they otherwise want to appear, and so on. But I think we shouldn't let people off the hook. Nationalism is our modern equivalent, but religious enthusiasm in the Middle Ages, or the imperative to wage war to make Rome greater 2,000 years ago. People have a role to play in this as well.
Very good point. So, Richard, given the challenges we have today, we discussed the weaponry and the ongoing wars, Ukraine, Gaza. What lesson would you want people to take from your book and apply today? It could be an educational lesson, doesn't have to be a practical one. In a way, what what's, I don't like this term takeaway, but what is the takeaway from your book for today's conflicts, for today's problems?
Well, I think my takeaway is rather depressing, actually. The takeaway is that war is, endemic in human history. The human beings have engaged in forms of warfare for a very, very long period of time, and we are still doing so in a world which regrets it. Of course, world opinion in inverted commas thinks how bad these things are. Please don't do them, but they still go on. Countries are now busy rearming because they think they might face threats in the future. What obviously we would like is for people to look at the history of war, my presentation of the history of war, and say to themselves, this is madness. Human beings have got to sit down in the 21st century, and we've got to be able to ensure that we don't do this anymore. A starting point might be, let's get rid of nuclear weapons, but we know that's not going to happen either. There's a horrible sense, I think, in which human beings, are their own worst enemy. We know how we ought to behave, and we know the kind of risks that we run. But here we still are in 2025 with people making rhetorical threats of nuclear warfare. So I think the lesson is, on the whole, rather depressing one. The ideal that somehow the 21st century will usher in a century of peace is very conditional. One would hope that more and more people would come in the end to see that the leaders who threaten war or promise war are not the leaders you want. You want different leaders. But how do you see that? When Germans elected Hitler in 1933, most Germans did not want to wage a world war again. They had their fingers badly burnt in the First World War. but they, extraordinarily enthusiastic for Hitler and for everything Hitler did. And when the war came, of course, they followed him to war.
We make conscious decisions towards war. You mentioned it's a tool in the toolbox, and I agree with that. We also, I think, sometimes, well, quite often actually, also make conscious decisions to cooperate, trade, cultural exchange, even doing nothing vis-a-vis a neighbor rather than something.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess what I'm also wondering is whether, and this is again where your book I think can be useful, whether we cannot become more conscious about that whole decision-making process. I don't think we are. That's why I'm raising it. I think
Mm.
even though we are conscious in those decisions, there's a point where we stop being conscious, where we go on automatic and just do whatever we think is best. Not to make it too complicated, do you think it's possible for us to have more choice in the decision of going to war or cooperation in the future?
Well, because we do cooperation, we cooperate a lot more and globally. And of course, we can't set, we shouldn't set that aside. And, indeed, modern world depends on a very high level of collaboration and cooperation. Um, Now, should we be more conscious of that? I mean, I think people are very conscious of it, but I think they're also very conscious of the limitations in trying to rein back a leader who gets a bit between his teeth and decides, as I said, that war is a solution, not the problem. A very large number of Israelis do not like what Netanyahu is doing. I imagine that quite a large number of Russians don't like what Putin is doing, but they're not allowed to say so. But how do you get your leaders to listen and to people who say, we don't want this. We want to be able to cooperate more. It's a complicated political processes, and on the whole, they don't work very well at a moment of violence. Perhaps, yes, my book will encourage people to think more about how do you solve that problem? How do you rein back somebody who is in the end dead set on waging war? Uh, if that's the focus of our attention, it's a good thing to focus on. But whether it will actually be effective, I think, is more difficult to say.
Well, I think that is exactly one of the values of your book is to make us think about, well, what do I think about these issues? Because I think you've stressed throughout this interview that it's not just leaders, it is citizens as well who affect the whole ambiance and who choose leaders, etc. Um, so hopefully more people will read the book and use it to that end, including in paperback, as you've mentioned. Um, Maybe one final question, idealistic one, but maybe necessary given all that you've written. Could you imagine a world, even hundreds of years from now, where we actually don't have war? I think you do actually suggest this, but is it our destiny to to um, to be at war? And I suppose I'm asking this again to contextualize it today in an era of tremendous, if we go to war with the weapons that we have today, more fully than we have, it's a problem. So do you think, could you imagine a future where we put war to bed?
Well, that's a very good question, quite a difficult question to answer. I can imagine it, obviously. Historians can have to imagine the past as well a lot. I can imagine a future like that. Um, I have to say it's unlikely, um, but it may well be in the course of a century that we come again and again to the cusp of mutual destruction, and we do finally get a bunch of leaders, preferably not men actually, a bunch of leaders who say to themselves, it really is nonsense. Time we set all this aside, put them aside, and focused on confronting big issues which human beings have got to cope with, whether it's ecology or climatic change or whatever it is, hunger, uh, and stop thinking that war might be a solution. I can imagine it, but I'd be skeptical of it happening, I think, in the foreseeable future.
Maybe constructively skeptical. and also slight silver lining. I think, there were so many concerns about nuclear weapons usage over the Ukraine war. And although this is not a predictive of the future, it hasn't happened so far. So
Yeah.
the NATO and Russia haven't clashed directly, but both sides have held back to some degree. I'm not trying to diminish the damage that has happened in Ukraine and the number of deaths on both sides, but there's some degree that of rational behavior on all sides, despite the irrationality of that war. So, um, but Richard, thank you for elucidating so much in your book. It's very worthwhile reading. I do recommend it to many people, exactly for the reason you've suggested, which is to make us think much more soberly and broadly about the causes of war and therefore how to mitigate it, especially in this era. So thank you very much for
Thank you.
being on Upstream, and hope to speak to you again sometime as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.